The first one is Alessia Matano, who is a researcher at the Institute for Environmental Sciences at the Vrije University in Amsterdam. Then we have Mirianna Budimir, who's the senior climate and resilience expert at Practical Action. And we have Towhidul Tarafder from Save the Children, who's a global advisor on climate and anticipatory action. But before we actually hear from them, we really want to hear from you. So I actually wanted to ask if everybody can jump into our Mentimeter. Maybe also good to mention that the community conversations will be recorded and are always posted also on YouTube afterwards. So there's a moment to be able to rewatch this if you're interested. But you should be able to use the QR code with your phone or the code that we have on the slide. And let me also see if I can drop the link in the chat later on as well. But hopefully this works. We'll have a look if some of you have already been able to enter. I see a couple of people already in there. So that's really good. And I'll actually move to our main Menti slide over here. So the main question that we wanted to ask you is actually what comes to mind for you when you think of multi-risk anticipatory action? What do you think of? In the past, we've done this exercise a couple times with a lot of people within the Anticipation Hub, and words that have come up ranged from a headache to important to difficult. There's a lot of conversations around this. So what I see here is also things that are resonating a lot with previous conversations. So complexity, absolutely, but then also reality, removing silos, multiple hazards. And I think that's really touching on some of the themes that we're going to be talking about today. So today we're going to try and show some examples of how we're trying to make it less difficult and less complex, how we're thinking about understanding these types of interacting risks, and what this also means in practice. So we'll first talk a little bit about the framing of this. So we've been doing a lot of community or in conversations within the working group and with different experts. And based on that, we've come up with a little bit of a typology, so a way to understand multi-risk from an anticipatory action point of view. So what is important? What does this mean? Why is it relevant? And then Mirianna and Towhidul will share some additional perspectives more on a practical side as well. And we're, of course, very keen to hear from you. So maybe before I pass on to Alessia, just one more question for everyone here on the call. And if you're joining new, you can still join us at the Menti code, which is at the top of this slide. This is an interesting extra question now. So this didn't completely go well, but how familiar do you feel with the concept of multi-risk anticipatory action? I see that we now have a double scale here. So instead of strongly agree, strongly disagree, maybe if you are not familiar at all, but strongly agree on that one. If you're very familiar, but strongly agree on that one. Sorry, this is a bit more complicated than it should be. But I see the first response is already in there. So there's some people that are somewhat familiar at the moment. Exactly. So yeah, some not familiar at all. See that bar is kind of moving up right now. All right, so we have a bit of a mix here. So we have a couple people that feel very familiar, but a majority that's on the spectrum from a little bit not familiar and somewhat familiar. So anyway, we'll probably have loads of examples to share between all of us. Yes, and this is, so keep this Menti open. We'll come back to it in a second. But before we do, I'm actually going to pass it over to Alessia Matano, who's going to share a little bit from the consultations we've done in the working group, some of the results from those discussions, and that's also going to be featured in a academic perspective paper that we're working on right now. So this is sort of a summary of some of those insights from the perspective paper. So over to you, Alessia.
Thanks so much. I'm sharing then my screen. Let's 1 second. Yeah. And now in presentation mode. And this. Yeah. Does it work? I cannot see you anymore. So...
Yeah, this is perfect.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you so much, Tessa, for this introduction. Very nice to see some of the answer from all of you from the first question. Yes, as Tessa was mentioned in the next sentence, I will just give a brief overview of our work that we have been carried out, led by Tessa, on multi-risk approaches in anticipatory action. And before to actually dive into that, I think it was quite important to kind of get an understanding of what are these multi-risk events, why we have used it a lot. You also used in your answer the word complexity. What does this mean actually? Why are they that complex? And in order to understand that one, we can actually have an overview of past events. We could think about in November 2020, for instance, the triple threat of floods, locusts, and COVID-19 that hit Somalia. So in that case, we had 3 events hitting at the same time and the same space. We could think about, for instance, cascading events like tropical storm that hit after the earthquake in Haiti, as well as, for instance, cascading drought and flood events in Peru and then in the Horn of Africa. Or if just looking at this month in September, we have been seeing a few headlines from newspapers about the Afghanistan earthquake, which actually compounded with enormous fragility of the country, as well as heavy rain that resulted in landslide in the war-torn Sudan. So if we look at all these events, we can try to identify a few characteristics that have in common. So the first one is that usually they are not the results of one single shock, but usually are the results of several hazards that could be natural or they could be societal hazards, like, for instance, conflict or disease outbreak, that they can occur at different space and time, as well as they usually hit a very fragile context, which presents structural poverty, very unstable governments, and so on. So first things, this complexity derived by the fact that there are multiple physical and social drivers. These drivers usually interact with each other over space and time. And this interaction, they could be casual, they could be independent, they could influence each other. And then the third element that we have been also seeing in these events, that there is the spatial and temporal variability, which really determine which kind of interaction are we looking at. Now, looking at this complexity, as a scientist, we have been done a lot of work in the last 5 years to try to really disentangle all of this condition. And we did it by looking at different risk elements. So, for instance, we look at exposure, hazard, vulnerability, but also, for instance, impacts and response. Try to understand how all of that interact. Identify, for instance, events that cascade, compound, connect. So a lot of terminology used, as well as we have explored different tools and assessment. You might have familiar with disaster forensic, so looking back into historical events and try to understand them better, as well as storylines. So think about plausible future and how things could have potentially unfold differently. So if this is what we have then done from the scientific point of view, the question is how actually well we have been able to integrate this multi-risk understanding into our operational practices. And to try to investigate that, I will go back to humanitarian disaster risk management cycle, which I think most of you are very familiar with. So I won't go through all the different phases, but I just would like to focus on the anticipatory action part, which we know is made of different components. We have the risk analysis, monitoring and forecasting, trigger design, early action, financing, and implementation. And we know that for the anticipatory action, is extremely important, the early warning system that is in place in the country. A research that has been done by UNBRR actually in 2024 actually has shown that we have 50% of countries that have shown or reported that they have a multi-hazard early warning system. And these are the one colored in blue in this global map. But in the moment that we look into the characteristic of this multiple hazard early warning system, then we see that most of them actually are multiple single hazard. So for instance, we might have an early warning system for drought and then a separate early warning system for flood, which actually they don't influence each other. What does it mean in practice? It means that, for instance, in the case of multi-risk events, our triggers and our threshold might not be that effective. It might mean that, for instance, we might have an event that is moderate, but because it occurred soon after another one, and then our coping capacity are actually way lower, and our vulnerability and exposure then it's higher, then we have devastating impact, but we are not able to depict that event in time. As well as we can see from the map that we have a very low coverage of very fragile conflict, violence contexts. And what does this mean? It means that we also have not been able to cover the aspect, for instance, of dissemination and communication, which is extremely important that this warning actually reach people, but it's extremely complex in such a fragile context. And a nice review has been done actually by Tesse that looked into 108 pre-agreements, show that the majority of them, 88 pre-agreements of anticipatory action, are actually focusing on single hazard, and then only 8 are actually from multiple hazard, but mainly cascading events, so for instance, cyclone and flood. And then 4 are focusing on the impacts of multiple hazards, so displacement and food insecurity. So also take into account what could be the interaction of multiple hazards. But what does this mean? It means that since most of the protocols that are in place are single hazard, when, for instance, we have strategies put in place, we don't know how effective is the strategy on the opposite hazard. So we know that, for instance, it's very effective in reducing the risk of the impact of drought, but then we don't know how effective is it to reduce the impact of a subsequent flood that might occur soon after. As well as there is a lot of challenges in the financial parts. And that's because we know we have limited resources, but when multiple shocks occur, we don't know which strategy do we need to prioritize in order to be able to address multiple shocks at the same time. But so what is there the problem? What is there the challenge? I mean, I explained you before that this crisis is complex disaster. I have a lot of elements of multi-risk. I showed you before that from the scientific point of view, we have been starting to explore that. We have provide frameworks, concepts, we have provide tools, but then on the ground, we have seen that the implementation is extremely low. And this is a bit what we have tried to investigate, try to understand what has been the challenge, but also the opportunity that we could actually use to be able to integrate more this understanding of multi-risk. So now we'll go through few of the phases of the anticipatory action part to try to address that. So for instance, on the risk analysis, as the scientists have the challenge, we haven't really focused so much on the societal hazard, but we had to focus a lot on the climate hazard and the hazard interaction. So all the societal elements are where a bit put it aside, as well as we have developed a lot of conceptual approaches, but rarely we have operationalized that one, upscaled that one, and usually most of our framework are seen as really complex and with a very confusing terminology for the practitioner. So from the scientific community, what we have suggested is that we should engage way more with the community. We should really take into account the context, and we should use, for instance, mixed method approach that allow also to investigate not only physical process, but also social processes. And then when we look into monitoring, forecasting, and trigger design, we know well that actually when we look at in countries with high inequalities and poverty levels, the identification of triggers and thresholds is extremely difficult. What we could do is to shift the focus from individual hazard triggers to impact level triggers, as big as we haven't seen it, that has already been put in place for a few anticipatory action protocols, as well as try to identify real-time indicator, because one very important aspect of this multi-risk is also the dynamic vulnerability and exposure, because things change very fast when the shock hit before that another one hit again. And then also the dynamic and multivariate thresholds. As I mentioned before, the context can change in this multi-risk setting. So that means that people might be more fragile, more exposed, more vulnerable, and therefore our threshold as well need to adjust to that to be able to identify potential event. And when we look into early actions and implementation, we have seen that has been enormous challenge from the practical practitioner side to be able to have an operational capacity in multi-risk setting. And that's because, for instance, you put in place certain action to address a certain event, but then another event hits, and then this action are not suitable anymore. So what to do? It's actually, we propose to develop more scenario-based approach where we actually could experience it, what are the effects of different action, as well as try to understand which strategies are able to address multiple shocks at the same time, which also help us to enhance the use of resources. So trying a bit to wrap up, in this very quick presentation, what I actually wanted to put as a message is that it's very important that we start to think about multi-risk approaches and understanding into our anticipatory action, because we have seen that in the past, just looking at one single hazard has not been very efficient in reducing and mitigating our impacts. Now, how to do it? It's still very challenging, but from the scientific point of view, we have already a few tools and a few understanding that can be connected into the practice. So it's very good that the practice side can kind of be informed by the scientific community, as well as the scientific community. We need also be informed what are the challenges in place. And with this, I want to finish and thank you for the attention. And if you have any question or curiosity, I don't know if we have time now, but also please feel free to contact us. Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you, Alessia. Yes, for anyone with questions, feel free to we have a couple minutes, so we could pause for a second. If you have a question now, feel free to raise your hand, or if you feel more comfortable typing, then you can also put it in the Mentimeter that we were using before. Tim, over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, I always feel slightly guilty asking a question because we run the conversation, so I don't want to jump in if someone else. So, but yeah, I guess it's really a clarification in that some parts of multi-risk anticipatory action make sense. So I can understand that, say you have a conflict zone and it's also flood prone, then you have to adapt your triggers, or you have to adapt the actions you can do to the fact that it's taking place in a conflict zone. And just on a recent visit to Sri Lanka, actually, I can understand that related hydrometeorological or climate hazards can have the same trigger. So they were talking about how floods and landslides both kind of come from heavy rainfall. So they can, if the rainfall gets very high in this region, they can say, look, it's going to flood, and there's also a higher risk of landslides. So you can do that. I guess where I'm sort of not so sure is if you have two kind of fairly different types of hazard, sort of a climate hazard. So if you have, say, a region that's drought prone, but also gets flash floods, I realize that might not be in many places. Is the argument that you should put both of those hazards into the same framework or system, or is it only where the hazards are kind of linked to each other and there's a kind of an overlap between the likely impacts and the likely causes? So you can say, well, this trigger will cause more than one hazard, or because it's like I think you mentioned droughts and floods as an example. I can't see how a framework would say have the same trigger levels, because they're obviously very different things. So I just wondered if there's like a limit to where multi-risk anticipatory action can go, and some of the hazards that we deal with and talk about have to be kept separate. You know, we can't merge some of them.
Yeah, no, very nice question, and thank you so much also to provide example on drought to flood. Actually, it will have been working the last year, so it's very nice. But yeah, so what we have seen it, of course, we are not actually arguing that we need to implement a multi-risk approach in every part of the protocols and so on, but we need to have that mentality to understand that systems interact between each other. And even opposite hazard, like the drought and then followed by a flood, there are actually a lot of interaction that happens, and that can reduce the way that our strategies are effective when we put them into place. An example is, for instance, when there is a drought, if it's extremely severe, our vegetation starts to die off, the soil might be very compacted. If there is a precipitation, we might result in actually a way higher severity of the flood than what we have been expected in our models. And then that means that actually our thresholds, we might have seen like, oh, we want to have a lot of impacts, but actually the impact is way higher. As well as we have to think that people, especially during a drought, which is low onset disaster, respond and adapt to these events. And doing that, they also put in place certain actions. And this one could actually exacerbate it, for instance, the flood. If we think of, for instance, a national level already, a reservoir operational response, of course, if in a drought context, the reservoir management trying to hold as much as water as possible until the end. But this, if it happens when there is a heavy rain and then they don't know what to do and they have been used to the drought condition, that this might be a result that then they have to do overspilling of the reservoirs that further exacerbated the flood downstream. So what I think it's really important here is to understand that it's very hard that event will act in isolation. Like the system will actually really interact, both the physical one and the social one. And we need to have that understanding in all the different phases of our anticipatory action steps.
Thanks, Alessia. Yeah, I think it's a good point to be clear that the trigger is not the only entry point, of course, for adding a multi-risk lens to anticipatory action. But I also see that Katja, your hand is up, so do feel free to jump in. And Alessia, we have one other question from Anna in the chat also for after.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Great. Hi, my name is Katja Osterwalder, and I'm based in Cairo. I'm with the UN Population Fund, and I'm a regional humanitarian analyst for the Middle East and North Africa. So thanks very much for your presentation, Alessia. In our region, we get a lot of questions on the intersection between conflict and climate, because for us it's very much linked, right? And as you mentioned, AA, I think historically has been the triggers itself have been linked to weather forecasting, and now there's this multi-risk approach. And how do we look at anticipatory actions for conflict, for example? So I liked what you said around shifting from individual hazards to impact level triggers. And I was just wondering if you could provide maybe some concrete examples on what you mean by impact level triggers, and then also connecting that with potential triggers related to conflict, but recognizing what Tesse you said about that triggers aren't the only entry point for that multi-risk approach.
Yes, thank you so much for the question. So super interesting. Yes, there are a few examples. Actually, my Tessa might know even better because she actually review all the anticipatory action protocols that were available. But what we mean when we looked into the impact is, for instance, when we look into food insecurity or displacement, then we are not assuming that a certain hazard is the one resulting to that food insecurity or to that displacement, but we start from identify certain indicator that actually showed us that, for instance, this level are are starting to increase, and there are different events, like for instance, it's both. We know that there is a lack of precipitation. We know that, for instance, it's going to hit an important season for the crop and so on. So there are different indicators that we look at to try to understand how this could be linked to the impact to the food insecurity. And this kind of overcome a bit the problem that we always had it before, to try, okay, which kind of hazard do we look into? Is this cascading? Is this compounding? And so on. So starting from the impact is always giving a bit the opportunity to have a broader look into what are the potential hazards and then triggers that we might use for our system. And then trigger is not the only entry point. Very good point indeed. And for instance, when we wanted to shift this approach from single hazard to multi-hazard, also in a conflict setting, the other shift that we might need to do, not only in the trigger and threshold side, but also in the type of strategies and action we want to put in place. So we have seen it, for instance, that if we if we actually suggest people during drought to move towards water sources, that might actually increase, for instance, more the conflict towards the very limited resources. So we might need to be very aware of which kind of strategies are we suggesting to the people, focusing not only of, okay, we want to address that hazard, but actually how that strategy might be able to be effective on the opposite hazards, or how does it fit into the context itself. And I don't know if Tessa, you want to add anything on this.
Yeah, I think this is, I think you point out the right things. What I think is really important there, and also in terms of examples, there are some examples where you can, for example, adapt the level of, for example, the drought trigger based on, for example, if there's recently been a lot of people displaced into a certain area because you expect that there might be more pressure on resources, or number of people in a flood-prone area, etc. So there's this thinking of being able to move with the level of risk that you're working with at a certain point. And I think a lot of field teams already know that, and communities often also know that, and it's more about how we're able to capture that in our frameworks down the line. So I think often it's actually a lot of people already know the connections, but it's being able to act on it with flexibility in the moment. And that also can sometimes just be linking up different plans to each other to say, if we already have an activated flood protocol in an area, and then a month later we activate for something else, we might make some adjustments here and there. And that can also be the case for conflicts. So you use some scenario planning basically for it. For the sake of time, because I know Anna put a question in the chat, Alessia, so maybe you want to have a look at it, but I think Towhidul will also speak about it for a second. I wanted to ask if everybody can jump back into the Miro board for a second and have a look at the next question. So this is a sort of recap question from what Alessia was saying also. So the question is, why should we consider a multi-hazard, multi-risk approach? And not saying that we should always do this and that it needs to be everywhere, but where it matters. I see most people are online. Curious what you think from the answers here. I see 2 people already say because risks are interconnected. I see some likes. Curious. I see a trend on the second answer here. And for those who joined just recently, the Mentimeter link is in the chat in here, and you can also use a code that is linked up here when you go to menti.com. But indeed, one of the reasons why we should consider this more and more is because risks are interconnected, as Alessia showed in some of her examples. Then this is a longer question, but what is the primary purpose of a multi-risk approach in anticipatory action planning. So what are we trying to achieve? Are we trying to prepare for the most likely and the most frequent events? Are we trying to reduce costs of disaster management? Are we trying to have a lot of single hazard plans in one document? Or are we trying to prepare for multiple hazards and interlinked risks? Again, I see a trend towards this last answer. Yeah, I think maybe we should have made the question more difficult. But yeah, indeed, I think this is, from our point of view right now, one of the main reasons. And the how is the main question, right? What does that look like? Yeah, so I think this also links to the how, but from your point of view, what do you think are some of the main challenges here? So I think Alessia mentioned a bunch of them, and I think we've diagnosed the challenges, but we're also really keen on hearing from you, and then we'll also move into what some of the solutions could look like. So very curious to hear from you. You can type in one word or you can type in a whole sentence. But what do you see as the main challenges here? Interesting. So a challenge might be community trust. I'd be really keen to hear from whoever put that in. Maybe in the chat you can add some details of why you think trust might be eroded, if that's a question of maybe not being able to explain it, or having a fear of missing events, or what the impact on trust could be. Also very curious to hear from others. Yeah, this is really interesting. So yeah, I think the work in different hazard spaces, so people who work on flood forecasting, people who work on drought forecasting or risk analysis even, they are trying to be more connected, but it's very specialized disciplines, of course, and the funding models to actually invest in some kind of change. And then also exactly the gap between end users. And I think this is something that Mirianna will also touch on in a second. Yeah, and exactly, like, do we want to add more complexity? I think that's been a big question that we've been reflecting on in the working group. And that's why I said triggers are not the only place where you can think of this, you know, like triggers don't need to necessarily be more complicated. And we also want to recognize that this doesn't need to be a data-driven approach always. So yeah, this is a point also on the data scarce environments. And indeed, the siloing is a big challenge. So it's can be one of those examples can be in, for example, conflict-prone area, to have people who work on conflict as part of the planning process, which often doesn't happen, or displacement, etc. Great. So I think we'll come back to this in a second also. Yeah, I think this would be really great. So maybe from all of you, we have a lot of experience here in the room. What is something that you'd be keen to share as an experience? So that can be positive or negative. One example that I can share is I was, for example, working on a feasibility study for anticipatory action in the West Bank, in Palestine, and there we really looked at being able to do heat and drought forecasting or anticipation, keeping in mind different scenarios in terms of conflict, movement, etc. So that was one of those experiences that I think kind of shows how you can think about feasibility assessments and considering multiple hazards, not just conflict, also, for example, looking at droughts and floods. But very curious if anybody has anything to share you'd like to add here. So we'll give you a couple of seconds, maybe a minute, to think about this. Yeah, and this is a really interesting one. So this is one example that really touches on situations, and this is very common, right? We have floods and heavy rainfall triggering floods and or landslides, and that there might be some disconnect sometimes between these different disciplines, and that can be really helpful to already prepare for in advance. Yeah, exactly. So this can also be one of those things that there's also consideration for host populations when we're looking at displacement. Really interesting. Just give it a little bit more time to see if anybody else has other examples. Maybe you recently experienced an event that you see as multi-hazard, multi-risk, or and you saw maybe something that worked well or didn't work well. Yeah, and I think this is also a really fair point, right? Like scaling up anticipatory action for a single hazard, for a flood, for a cyclone, and this might be a further barrier. One of those examples maybe is in Madagascar recently, the triggers were connected between floods and cyclones. So that doesn't mean that you set up a whole multi-hazard, multi-risk protocol, but there is a connection between two existing single hazard plans, and that helps implementation down the line. And because cyclones often trigger or are associated with floods as well. All right, great. I'll leave the chat open also for anybody else if you want to add anything or share anything for the rest of the audience. I'll maybe pass it over to Mirianna, who's going to speak a little bit more about the early warning system side of things. And they recently did a really, really interesting paper, which we'll share on what does it actually look like to have a multi-hazard early warning system. Are we on the right track? And what is the usefulness for anticipatory action also, right? Like not just having the warning system, but also being able to implement action on the ground or help communities take action on the ground. So Mirianna, over to you for a short ignite on the main findings from your work.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to try and keep this pretty rapid and short, and yeah, we encourage everyone to read the full paper, and if you have any questions, happy to continue discussing. So yeah, happy to present this on behalf of Practical Action and IASA, and funded by the Zurich Climate Resilience Alliance. And so this is a piece of work that we kind of more of a thought piece where we're working across Latin America, Africa, and our Asia countries. We work on early warning systems with closely with communities at risk. And we think about early warning systems considering the four main components and then the four overarching components. And we were always really struggling with that kind of the multi-hazard approach. Thinking about that definition in terms of it's an early warning system that's supposed to think about several hazards and potentially the interactions between those hazards, and how do you think about the early warning system and how do we do that operationally to support those who are most at risk. So our starting point was if we're thinking about providing early warning systems for people who are at risk, they do need to be thinking about those multi-hazards and multi-risks that people are facing, and what does that actually mean in practice. So thinking about this in terms of what does that mean, the different types of interactions that we need to be thinking about is the triggering. So this might be in case of people might be advised to leave their houses due to an earthquake, but actually they might be at high risks of a tsunami because they're outside. So we need to be thinking about that. Amplification, we might need to update flood warning thresholds after a wildfire because the flood risks is increased after the wildfire has affected the environment. Thinking about compounding hazards, this is in terms of whether we're advising people to shelter in place. So thinking about COVID, or they need to evacuate because there's also a flood happening at the same time. We saw this quite frequently during COVID. Also thinking about advice in terms of whether people shelter in the basement so they're protected from wind-related hazards, or they need to be sheltering in the top floor because the flooding is going to be affecting it. So it really affects, what advice we're advising. And then also considering kind of consecutive hazards, one happening after the other, is
recognizing that people's capacities are really diminished between those events, and then also thinking about migration and displacement that potentially could affect people at great risk of subsequent hazards. So this is things that people have been talking about in this session already. So this is just thinking about what does that mean in terms of how do we do this for the early warning system. So a couple of things is we're starting with the first mile, starting with the people who are most affected. We recognize that in the real world, hazards do interact and people are experiencing these hazards, and so those warning systems must respond to this and provide a multi-hazard, multi-risk approach to the early warning system to be able to serve those who are most at risk. So if we're thinking about that, then what do we need to kind of work backwards to in terms of what that means for the early warning system? So it's recognizing, vulnerability is dynamic, people's experiences are affected, and people have different vulnerabilities to different hazard types. They have their vulnerability changes over time, and some people are more susceptible to hazards than others. Recognizing that also that the impacts from multi-hazard events are bigger than single hazards, and the multi-risk is really the real world. So we started thinking through some of the things that what does that mean in terms of specifics for the different components of an early warning system, which respond to people's mandates and responsibilities, and just kind of posing questions in terms of the people-centered nature of that multi-hazard early warning system. So I won't go into detail for these, but just a couple of things is thinking about doing hazard interrelationships and multi-hazard scenarios to understand what those to understand the risks that people are facing, thinking about changing thresholds for different between different hazard events, thinking about having coordinated and kind of consistent, coherent communication dissemination protocols that work for different hazards and aren't providing alternative or contradictory advice. And then also thinking about early action protocols that vary but also aren't building in asymmetries and potential kind of misrepresenting advice in terms of what early actions people can take depending on those hazards. A couple of other things to be thinking about is just issues of scale, locality, geography. Like, are we talking about national systems? Are we talking about community-based systems? Who chooses which hazards you focus on, and who has power over making those decisions? So there's lots of things we need to be thinking about in terms of what does that practically mean if you're trying to implement or build a multi-hazard early warning system. So we came up with some practical entry points. These are not holistic. These are just some initial thoughts and definitely welcome other ideas. So we divide them into kind of research sector, policy and practice kind of entry points to start trying to work towards multi-hazard early warning systems. And just some kind of overarching thoughts, really starting with assessing honestly, like where you are in terms of whether you feel like you're on a single hazard early warning system, whether you're on multiple single hazard early warning systems operating in silo, or whether you've got connections between maybe your early action protocols are joined up and considering multi-risk, but actually your forecasting isn't. So really understanding where you are in that journey in terms of what your status is, and then starting with what you have and connecting it. So it might be that you think that you want to start with the building the trigger thresholds, so they're considering the multi-risks. It might be that you think that the communication protocols need to be coherent and coordinated across different hazard types. But yeah, just thinking about what is the next step to connect what you have and build on what you already have. Coordination across sectors and agencies is really important. So the building those MOUs, those relationships, data sharing is really essential, and ultimately coming back to that equity and inclusion and recognizing that that's, if we start with that, then the whole system will be working for those who are most marginalized and most at risk, and engaging those communities as co-producers, not just recipients, not just end users of warning products, so they can feed into what they need, when they need it, what hazards affect them, what are their risks, and then they're more empowered to take early action that reduces the risks from those warnings that they receive. A couple of just next steps to be thinking about what we identified. So definitely further analysis of existing multi-hazard early warning system practices, including in the global north, would be really essential. So if there are examples, we'd love to hear more about them. I think there's a need for a kind of a common vision of what we need to be aiming for. So what is this kind of gold standard of a people-centered multi-hazard early warning system, and an agreed kind of conceptual framework of what that looks like, and agreed by the early warning system community. And then working from that is what is a potential kind of stepwise process, or like a roadmap of where you are now to where you need to be, and where you want to get to that gold standard. And that will be really kind of context specific. And so the last thing is then recognizing that it's really context specific, is piloting and testing different approaches and comparing them in terms of what is the best practice and learning from going from where we are now to this kind of gold standard multi-hazard early warning systems. What are those different routes that people can take, and having kind of examples from developing country contexts and hazard specific solutions. And that's it. I will share the link to the paper in the chat for those who want to read a little bit more. But if you have any questions, happy to answer them or reach out on email. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mirianna. That's a rapid fire overview of where we are on the multi-hazard early warning systems. And there's loads more to unpack here, so I think we'll have some further discussions on this. For the sake of time, I'm going to pass it straight to Towhidul, but please drop your questions in the chat for Mirianna, and hopefully we'll have a bit of time after the Ignites to come back to them, or maybe in the chat. But I'll pass it to Towhidul, who is Global Advisor on Anticipatory Action for Save the Children, and he will share a little bit more about some of how they're approaching the different types of protocols or frameworks in place for different hazards, and how it's being connected. So over to you, Towhidul. I hope you're with us and connected. And please drop any questions in the chat, as I already said.
Yeah, Tesse, thank you so much. So I'm trying to sharing the presentation, but unfortunately it's not going. Tesse, just for 1 minute, can I share this presentation to your MS team, and could you please share it? Not working
Yes,
here.
and I will also ask him if you're able to make Towhidul a presenter. So I think that should also solve the sharing issue. But feel free to email it to me, Towhidul, and I'll set them up, and you can already jump in if you want to.
Yes, Tesse, just give me 1 second, please.
I think you now have sharing rights, so you should be able to share yourself on Teams. And while we get set up, do please drop any questions from Mirianna also in the chat. Towhidul, can you confirm if the sharing option is now enabled on Teams for you?
Okay, Tesse, I think now it's good for me.
Perfect. Over to you.
So can you see my screen, Tesse?
Yes, absolutely. And for the last 7 minutes of the call, I'll hand it over to you. Over.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much. Very short time. So welcome to the participant to the committee discussion on the climatic, multi-hazard, and multi-risk into anticipatory action, and how we are capturing this information into the anticipatory action planning. So if you can think about that, okay, in current days, many of the hazards are coming in multiple ways. For example, when the flood is coming, so disease outbreak is one of the hazards that are happening at the community level. So crops and displacements is another problem created by the flood. Even though for cyclone in the same community, that's also induced salinity, the high tidal surge is happening. Sometimes it's disturbing the different services damages the wash infrastructure. So similarly, for the drought, it's sometimes when it's coming, it's also created another hazard for the food insecurity. It causes for the escalating the conflict situation, especially for the African region. And for the Asian countries, some of the cases, if there is a heavy rainfall chance, so it will sometimes also trigger the landslide. So Save the Children approach, the multi-hazard and multi-risks, especially we are working on the child-centered approach. So during this anticipation development process, we include children to identify the multi-hazard and multi-risk in their education sector, their family livelihood and food security sector, including also the family level different sectoral interventions. So that's for why Save the Children developed the multi-hazard and multi-risk assessment process, which is related to the child-centered approach. And this guideline also mentioned about that how the hazards is coming, since the hazards are not coming in single way, so it's mostly coming in the different consequences. For example, flood causes for the disease outbreak, and the risk is the different level. The risk dynamics are also different. The risk for the children, the risk for the livelihood groups, the risk for the community members, risk for the health facility, different service facilities are different. So that's for why the multi-risk and multi-hazard and multi-risk is one of the priority in the risk assessment process. And overall, how this hazard and consequences process are impacting to the different sectoral intervention, like the food security, education, and protection. So considering all these aspects, so how it could be addressed in a joint approach in the anticipatory action planning system. So my previous speaker, Mirianna, also mentioned about the anticipatory action plan or early action protocol. So that's for why we need to think about in practically that how the multi-hazard forecasting system are in place and how we can consider the multi-risk modeling in different phases. And based on that, how we can develop the multi-hazard and multi-risk early warning system, especially for the children, especially for the inclusive early warning system. And how this multi-hazard and multi-risk informed decision-making process can be incorporated in the anticipatory action plan. That's mean how the anticipatory action plan can be developed, can be promoted at the different level. And the anticipatory action plan, which will need to be developed at the community level, how it is integrated with the different sectoral activities, for example, education, child protection, health, and food security. For example, if the flood happen in the community, so in that cases that the risk of child protection is different, and when the disease outbreak happening due to cause of the flood, so in that cases the risk for the child protection is something different. So in the same situation, in the same context, but there is the two hazard is happening. So now it's a thinking process that how it would be accumulated in one single planning process. So that's we are trying to defining, and we have some of the good examples that I'm going to share. And finally, how the multi-stakeholder is coming with this early action protocol development process or anticipatory action development process. So in considering this multi-sectoral approach, multi-risk approach, so definitely it is one of the innovative solutions for building the resilient community. So just going to share a quick example of the multi-hazard anticipatory action system and approach, which currently we have developed for the Sudan, which is the early action protocol system. So in shortly, for example, that if there is a certain chance of the heavy rainfall happening, so forecast is saying, the risk forecast is saying there is a certain chance of the likelihood of the heavy rainfall in the next month. So in that cases, it means that flood will be happening in the community. And by this time, the community is already impacted or under the threat of the different disease outbreak issues due to cause of the water contamination, due to cause of the mosquito breeding, for the flood water, stagnant water. And even though the last year stagnant water also escalating this type of crisis situation in the community level. So considering this, if the rainfall is one of the heavy rainfall is one of the threats, so that's also causes for the flooding and the disease outbreak. So definitely how to address this flooding and disease outbreak in the same time. So that's for why we have developed the different threshold mechanism for the flooding and different threshold mechanism for the disease outbreak. And based on the different threshold, we have identified this the trigger. So what type of trigger is will need to be activated for the phase 1 and phase 2, even though sometimes it will be the phase 3 if it is the for drought. So and definitely the action need to be different. What would be the phase 1 for the flood and what will be the phase 1 for the disease outbreak? For example, for the flood, is the phase 1 is the preposition of the stock or some of the sharing the early warning messages and advisories. Maybe people need the relocations, but the phase 2 is something different. That's morely need the rapid response, rapid support to the community before the flood took in place. So at the same time, maybe the disease outbreak is already have started, or in some places where the low-lying areas flood water already entered, and there is a certain chance of increasing the cholera and malaria. So definitely in that cases, there are some certain mechanism already established that what are the triggering mechanism for trigger 1, which is, for example, the distribution of the child-centered risk communication messages. And in the same cases, the trigger 2 is something that immediately need the water points and wash facilities. Maybe in the trigger 1, community children can establish the child protection surveillance campaigning, health campaigning can be started. So that's, which means that if there is a sudden, if the heavy rainfall is one of the forecasted hazards, so in that cases, the multiple risks need to be identified, and multiple trigger, multiple threshold can be identified based on the each risk. And according to that, the early action need to be defined in different, considering the different hazard, considering the different risks, considering the different trigger and threshold. So that's we develop a community base, which is mostly the locally laid anticipatory action plan for the community, so that the community can implement this anticipatory action initiative before the crisis on places. So that is the example. So this early action protocol is mostly focused on the drought, human diseases, and for the flood. So this is a joint protocol, which is a multi-hazard and multi-risk. So before developing this protocol, there is a certain steps need to be completed: the risk assessment process, multi-sectoral risk assessment process, then multi-sectoral trigger development process, and also identify the multi-sectoral early action activities. So this is one of the example from the GFOP funded anticipatory action project from the Sudan. So thank you so much. If the participant, you have any of the question, feel free to ask me, or you can reach me through the email as well also.
Amazing, Towhidul. Thank you so much. And this was a rapid fire example of something that has a lot of moving parts. So I think, and this also connects a bit to the question of how do you communicate this also with community. So I think a follow-up conversation we can also have is how you're approaching the communication side of this as well, because I can imagine many people have a lot of questions around that too. For the sake of time, we're going to leave it here, but do please reach out to our different speakers if you want to learn more. The best place to continue this conversation is in the working group on multi-risk anticipatory action, which convenes quarterly, and we do some specific webinars and discussions every now and then. And we're really, really keen to hear more examples and critical questions. So if you're if you have a supply of either of those, do please reach out. We're really keen to keep the conversation going. And then I'll pass it on to Tim, maybe for a couple for the closing. But really, thank you for joining. Also for those people who are watching the recording online later on, and do reach out.
Yeah, thanks very much, Tess, and to all the presenters. Yeah, it was very interesting. I feel I know more about it now, which is good. And as I think we saw in the chat, there is a working group on this. So for those who weren't there right when we opened the community conversation, the working group I think is open to new members, so you can get in contact. And if you want to find out more, there's also resources on there. Page on the Anticipation Hub website and links to the stuff that they're doing. And I think as well, I hope I'm not getting ahead of myself, the paper that Mirianna talked about will also be a blog coming up in October. So we'll share that as well in the usual channels. So do keep an eye out for that. And I guess as it feels like we've come off a long summer, I certainly have. I think the other thing from our side is to say, thank you once again to the conflict working group. The multi-risk working group for today's presentation and for all the comments in the chat. And we do have a number of dialogue platforms coming up, which will be another opportunity to discuss some of this further, to look specifically at examples from different regions. So we have the Western Central Africa dialogue platform is coming up in October. Asia Pacific will be happening in November, I think, and the Global Dialogue platform is happening in December in Berlin. And so, yeah, please just follow the newsletter, follow the website, and on LinkedIn as well. You'll get updates about how to join there and about the sessions and the agendas coming up. And yeah, so thanks once again to everyone. And we hope to see you online or in person very soon.
Thank you so much. Have a nice day.
Thanks all.